She lifted her napkin from her lap, folded it along its original crease with the steady hands of someone who has learned that composure is the only armor that cannot be taken from you. And then she raised her wine glass toward the far end of the table, toward Rowan Ashcroft, who sat in his customary silence at the opposite end, watching her with the careful attention he always gave to things he could not change. And she drank. Not a toast, not a performance. Simply a woman deciding, in the space of one breath, that she would not give Gideon Ashcroft the satisfaction of watching her flinch. This is the story of what came after that dinner, of ledgers opened in the small hours of a January night, of a letter never sent, of a woman who had mistaken usefulness for belonging, and who discovered, in the wreckage of a marriage she had believed adequate, that she had been worth far more than she was ever permitted to know. Gideon had leaned in and said, without raising his voice, that he wanted her gone from Aldervale before the month was out. He had said it the way a man says something he has already decided, not a threat, not a question, but a scheduling matter. He had said it between the soup course and the fish, with the chandelier casting warm light over 12 oblivious guests, and he had smiled when he said it, because the smile was the point. Vivienne did not answer him. She folded her napkin. She raised her glass toward Rowan. She drank. And then she turned back to the table and finished the meal. The guests departed by 10:30. Harriet Colville was the last to put on her coat. Harriet, who had known Vivienne since they were both girls in a provincial drawing room, who had watched Vivienne accept the proposal of Gideon Ashcroft 4 years earlier, with the careful expression of a woman choosing security over happiness and telling herself they were the same thing. Harriet found her in the upstairs corridor outside the bedroom door, standing with one hand resting flat against the wall as though she needed something solid. "Vivienne," Harriet said. "I'm quite all right," Vivienne said. Harriet pressed a key into her palm. It was a small brass key, worn smooth at the bow. "The spare room and bath," Harriet said. "Second drawer of the writing table has fresh paper. The landlady knows my name. You can be there by morning if you need to be." Vivienne looked at the key for a moment. Then she closed her fingers around it. "Thank you," she said. "I don't need it tonight." "I know," Harriet said. "That's why I'm giving it to you now." After Harriet had gone, Vivienne locked her bedroom door. She had been locking it for 14 months, and Gideon had stopped trying the handle after the first 3, and sat down at her writing table. The candles burned low. She did not write anything. She did not cry. She opened the household account book she kept in the right-hand drawer and turned to the page she had been annotating for the past 6 weeks. And she sat there in the diminishing light, reading the same column of figures she had read a dozen times before. And she began, very quietly, to understand what she was going to do about them. She was 36 years old. She was the daughter of a country parson. She had been educated above her station by a father who believed that intelligence was not a class distinction. And she had entered the Ashcroft household as a lady's companion at 28. And at 32 she had accepted Gideon Ashcroft's proposal because he had offered her something she had never possessed, not love. She had been honest enough with herself about that. But a position, a household to manage, and the reasonable expectation that usefulness would be rewarded with permanence. She had been useful. She had been extraordinarily useful. She had managed the domestic accounts of Aldervale Manor with a precision that the previous steward had not come close to, had reorganized the household expenditure in the first year and reduced waste by a third, had sat through 4 years of county dinners and social obligations and the particular silence of a marriage in which 2 people occupy the same house without ever truly occupying the same room. She had done all of it without complaint, because complaint had never seemed like a productive use of her time. The candles went out one by one. She sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around her. Then she went to bed, and she slept without difficulty, because she had found, over the past 4 years, that the only reliable way to manage a problem was to treat it as a problem, to define its edges, assess its components, and begin. Gideon had told her she had until the end of the month. She had, by her count, 23 days. She intended to use every one of them. The estate office occupied the east wing of the ground floor, a room of oak paneling and filing cabinets, and the particular smell of documents that have been handled by men who consider themselves the natural custodians of other people's affairs. Vivienne presented herself there at 9 o'clock the following morning, wearing her gray wool walking dress and carrying nothing but a small leather notebook. The clerk, a young man named Fitch, who had the unhappy quality of being loyal to whoever paid his salary, looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who has been given instructions he would prefer not to carry out. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" Fitch said. "Good morning," Vivienne said. "I require access to the household financial records for the past 4 years, the drainage expenditure reports in particular, and the correspondence with the county board." Fitch's hands moved to the surface of his desk in a gesture that managed to be both apologetic and immovable. "I'm afraid Mr. Ashcroft has given instructions." "I am aware that Mr. Ashcroft gives instructions," Vivienne said. "I am also aware that those records include expenditures made during a period when I held direct administrative responsibility for this household. I am asking to see the documentation of that work." "Mr. Ashcroft has instructed me that the office is not to be made available to you," Fitch said, and he had the grace to look uncomfortable about it. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. She wrote 2 words in her notebook, drainage, county, and closed it. "Thank you, Fitch," she said, and she left. She went directly to her sitting room, which was a small room on the first floor that had the advantage of a south-facing window and the disadvantage of being adjacent to Gideon's study, and she sat down at the table with her notebook open and waited. She had not been waiting an hour when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Gideon's deliberate tread, but the quieter, more purposeful step of a man carrying something heavy. She turned to find Rowan Ashcroft standing in the open doorway of her sitting room with 4 ledger books stacked in his arms. He was 33 years old and had the build of a man who spent more time outdoors than his position strictly required. Not tall, but solid, with the kind of unhurried economy of movement that comes from years of managing a large property on a practical rather than a ceremonial basis. He was Gideon's younger brother and bore almost no resemblance to him. Where Gideon was polished, Rowan was plain. Where Gideon was fluent, Rowan was precise. He had administered Aldervale Manor's estate accounts for 7 years, and he had done it with a thoroughness that Vivienne had noticed within her first month of marriage and had never quite been able to account for. He set the 4 ledger books on her table without speaking. He did not explain himself. He did not offer a preamble. Vivienne looked at the books. She looked at him. She asked him directly, "Whose side are you on?" Rowan did not answer in words. He pulled the chair from the far side of the table, positioned it across from her, and opened the first ledger. She watched him for a moment, the way he turned to the correct page without searching for it, the way his index finger moved along a column of figures with the automatic confidence of someone who has read this document many times. She pulled the ledger toward herself and began to read. Over the 14 evenings that followed, the library at Aldervale became theirs by default. Gideon did not use it in the evenings. The household staff had learned, in the way that household staff always learn, to be elsewhere when certain people were occupied with certain things. And so from 7 o'clock until the manor clock struck 11, Vivian and Rowan sat on opposite sides of the library table with the ledgers spread between them, and they worked. The drainage reports were the center of it. Aldervale Manor had submitted drainage improvement claims to the county board across 3 consecutive years, significant sums, invoiced against contracted work that was described in precise technical language in the paperwork, and cross-referenced against dates of completion and surveyor's sign-off. The problem, as Vivian identified it on the 4th evening and set before Rowan without ceremony, was that the work described in the invoices did not correspond to the work recorded in the estate's own maintenance logs for those same years. "Here," she said, pushing a page toward him. "November of the first year. The invoice to the county board claims drainage work completed on the north field and the lower pasture. The maintenance log for November records fencing repairs on the east boundary and rethatching on the grain store. There is no entry for drainage work." Rowan looked at the 2 documents side by side. "It could be a logging error," he said. "It could be," Vivian agreed, "except that the same discrepancy appears in February of the 2nd year and again in September of the 3rd. She set 2 more pages beside the first. 3 separate invoices, 3 separate months in which the county board was billed for works that the estate's own records do not show were carried out. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the documents with the expression she had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. Not surprise, precisely, but the particular stillness of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed by evidence he wished he had not found. "You knew," she said. Not an accusation. A question. "I suspected," he said. "I did not have the county board invoices to compare against." Gideon handled that correspondence himself. Outside the library windows, January pressed against the glass. The fire had burned down to a steady, businesslike heat. Vivian pulled the next ledger toward herself and turned to the page she had marked with a strip of paper. Bath Society, meanwhile, was receiving a different account of events at Aldervale Manor. Gideon had been circulating a version of the past 4 years that placed Vivian at its center as a woman of unstable temperament and diminishing capacity. A wife who had been given every advantage and had failed to manage either her household responsibilities or her own mental composure. The phrase "nervous collapse" had apparently been used in at least 2 drawing rooms, because Harriet reported it to Vivian in a letter that arrived on the 9th day, along with the information that 2 of Vivian's social calls had gone unanswered that week. Vivian read Harriet's letter at breakfast and put it in her coat pocket and did not think about it again until the evening, when she mentioned it to Rowan in the library. "2 families," she said. "Which 2?" Rowan asked. She told him. He recognized both names. County families, old connections, the sort of people whose opinions moved in predictable patterns once a social narrative had been established. He did not offer her reassurance, which she appreciated, because reassurance would have been dishonest. The solicitor's letter arrived 3 days after that. It came from a firm in Bath, on heavy cream paper, with Gideon's name printed at the top as the instructing party. And it set out separation terms with the clinical efficiency of a document designed to communicate not just its legal content, but its author's confidence that the matter was already decided. The terms were: no income, no property, no claim on the household she had managed for 4 years. A sum described as reasonable provision that amounted, when Vivian calculated it against current living costs in Bath, to approximately 14 months of modest survival. She read the letter once. She folded it carefully along its original creases and tucked it into the back of the ledger she was currently annotating. The 3rd year's accounts, the ones with the September discrepancy. And she returned to the column of figures she had been working through before the post arrived. Across the table, Rowan watched her do this. He did not say anything about the letter. He turned back to his own ledger. After a moment, Vivian reached for her pen, and they continued. She went to Bath on a Thursday, unannounced, carrying a leather satchel that contained her annotated summary of the drainage discrepancies. 6 pages of figures, cross-referenced and dated, written in the clear, unhurried hand of a woman who has spent 4 years keeping records that other people preferred not to examine too closely. The solicitor's office was on a quiet street off the main thoroughfare, up a flight of stairs that smelled of coal smoke and old paper. The solicitor himself was a man of about 50 named Caldwell, who received her with a particular brand of courteous alarm that men of his profession reserve for women who arrive without appointments and carry documents. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Caldwell said. "I'm afraid I was not expecting." "No," Vivian agreed, sitting down without being invited to. "I wanted to discuss the separation terms your office sent to Aldervale Manor." Caldwell arranged his hands on the desk in a manner that suggested he was preparing to be reasonable. "The terms were prepared at Mr. Ashcroft's instruction and represent a generous—" "They represent nothing of the kind," Vivian said. "I administered this household for 4 years. I reorganized its domestic expenditure, managed its accounts, and maintained its social obligations without assistance and without additional remuneration beyond the position itself. The terms your letter describes contain no acknowledgement of that work and no provision drawn from the estate's income during the period of my administration. Mrs. Ashcroft, I understand that this is a difficult— I also want to discuss 3 specific figures." She opened her satchel and placed her annotated summary on the desk between them. "These are amounts invoiced to the county board in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd years of my residence at Aldervale. The invoices describe drainage works completed on the estate. The estate's own maintenance records for those same periods contain no corresponding entries. The total discrepancy across the 3 years is £1,240. Caldwell looked at the document on his desk. He did not pick it up. "You have no standing to dispute the separation terms," he said. "Any counterclaim would require a male guarantor to bring it before the county assembly." "I am not making a counterclaim today," Vivian said. "I am informing you of figures that I intend to bring to the county assembly myself, under the provisions for petitioning on matters of public record, unless the terms of the separation are revised to reflect my actual contribution to the estate during the years in question." Caldwell's expression had moved past courteous alarm into something more careful. "I would strongly advise you, Mrs. Ashcroft, to consult with your own legal representative before making any such—" "I would strongly advise Mr. Ashcroft," Vivian said, "to revise his terms." She closed her satchel and stood. "Good day, Mr. Caldwell." He asked her to leave. She was already leaving. She went down the stairs and out onto the wet pavement of the Bath Street, and she stood for a moment in the cold air while the transaction settled around her. And then she took the small notebook from her coat pocket and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page and recorded, in her precise hand, every specific word Caldwell had said to her in the order he had said it. She wrote until the notebook was back in her pocket, and she had committed the exchange to paper in a form that could not be disputed or misremembered. The carriage back to Aldervale took 40 minutes. When it turned through the manor gate in the early dusk, Rowan was standing at the gatehouse, his coat collar turned up against the cold, waiting. He did not ask her how it had gone. He fell into step beside her carriage as it slowed, and when she descended, he looked at her face and understood what he needed to understand. "He will escalate," Rowan said. "Yes," Vivian said. "Then we need to be further ahead than we are." She looked at him in the gray evening light. "Then we had better go back to the library." It was late, past midnight, and the fire in the library had been built up twice already against the January cold. when Vivian reached for the next ledger on the lower shelf and found that it did not come away cleanly. She pulled it free, and a folded piece of paper fell from between its pages and dropped onto the flagstone floor at her feet with a sound barely louder than a breath. She picked it up. The paper was folded in the way of a letter. 3 horizontal folds, the kind a person makes when they intend to seal something and then do not. She turned it over. There was no address on the outside, no name. The paper had the particular quality of something that has been handled many times and then set aside and not touched again. She recognized the handwriting before she had finished unfolding it. She had been looking at Rowan's hand in the ledgers for 2 weeks. His numbers precise and even, his annotations brief and without flourish. The letter was dated 4 years earlier. 3 weeks, she calculated, before Gideon had proposed to her. She read it in full, standing beside the library shelf in the low candlelight, with the cold coming off the stone floor through the soles of her shoes. It was not addressed to anyone by name. It began without preamble, the way a man writes when he knows no one will read what he is setting down. It said that he had watched her for 2 years. Not watched in the way of surveillance, but in the way of a person who cannot help noticing someone who is worth noticing. It said that he believed, with a conviction he had not been able to argue himself out of, that she deserved more than a position of service in another family's house, and that she deserved more than the particular kind of security that came from being useful rather than valued. It said that he had no right to tell her any of this because he had nothing to offer. No title, no property, no income beyond the administrator's salary that his brother paid him, and that a woman of her quality deserved more than the second son's portion of nothing. It did not say that he loved her. It did not need to. It said something more precise than that, and more honest, and harder to dismiss. She stood with the letter in her hands for what might have been 2 minutes or 10. Then she folded it exactly as it had been folded, along the same creases, in the same order. And she placed it back between the pages of the ledger, and she returned the ledger to its place on the lower shelf. She extinguished her candle and went to bed. She did not speak to Rowan for 3 days. On the 3rd day, word came from Bath. Harriet arrived at Aldervale in person, which was unusual enough that Vivian met her at the door rather than waiting for her to be shown up. Harriet's expression was the one she wore when she had news that required delivering in full rather than softened. They sat in the upstairs sitting room. Harriet told her what she had heard. That a woman named Mrs. Thorne, a seamstress who had worked at Aldervale Manor until 18 months earlier, had given a signed statement to the county magistrate. The statement claimed that Vivian had mismanaged household funds during the last 2 years of her administration. It was specific. It named figures. It named dates. It was, Harriet said, the kind of document that sounded credible enough to be repeated. It has already been repeated, Harriet added. 2 county families withdrew their invitations this morning. Vivian sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire. Mrs. Thorne was dismissed 18 months ago, she said, for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Gideon let her go when he reduced the household staff. I know that, Harriet said. She would have reason to be willing, Vivian said, not to Harriet but to herself. That evening, the news came from another quarter. Rowan sent a note to her sitting room, a short one, 3 lines, informing her that he had submitted his formal resignation as a state administrator to the county land registry that afternoon. The document cited an irreconcilable conflict of duty. It had been witnessed and dated. She read the note twice. She put it in her coat pocket and asked for her coat, and walked to Harriet's house in Bath. which took her 40 minutes on foot through the cold evening streets, and she arrived at Harriet's door to find Rowan already there, sitting in the front parlor with his hat in his hands. Harriet, who understood the requirements of a particular kind of conversation, found a reason to be elsewhere in the house. Vivienne sat down across from Rowan. She looked at him with the steady, specific attention she gave to things that required accuracy. "You resigned your position," she said. "Yes," Rowan said. "Gideon has written to say you are no longer welcome at Aldervale." "I know. I received the same letter." She looked at him. He was sitting with his hat balanced on his knee, not fidgeting with it, not performing composure, simply holding it in the way of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see what comes next. She noticed that his hands were steady. She noticed that he did not look like someone who regretted what he had done. "That position was your livelihood," she said. "It was the only income you had." "Yes," Rowan said. "You gave it up to file a document that publicly contradicts your brother's account of this household." "That is what I did," Rowan said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the parlor window, Bath went about its evening business, carriage wheels on wet stone, voices from the street below, the particular sound of a city that does not stop for other people's difficulties. "What do you need from me?" she said, "to finish what we started?" He met her gaze directly for the first time since she had sat down. "The county board invoices," he said. "I kept independent copies of the estate records during my tenure. Correspondence logs, surveyor reports, payment confirmations. I have them at my lodgings. If we can match them against the invoices you have annotated, we have a complete picture." "Then bring them," Vivienne said. "Tomorrow morning, here." He nodded. He put his hat on. He stood to go, and then he stopped at the parlor door and turned back. "Vivienne," he said. She had not heard him use her given name before. It sounded different from the way Gideon said it, less like a possession being referenced, more like a person being addressed. She waited. "I am sorry," he said, "that it took this long to be useful." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been useful for longer than you think," she said. "Go and get your records." Mrs. Thorne arrived at Harriet's house the following morning without announcement, at 8:30, while the breakfast things were still on the table. She was a woman of about 50, with the careful dress of someone who has known better circumstances and is managing present ones with dignity. She asked for Mrs. Ashcroft specifically, and Harriet showed her to the small sitting room at the back of the house, where Vivienne was already at the table with Rowan's independent records spread before her. Mrs. Thorne sat down without being invited, which Vivienne found encouraging. She placed a sealed envelope on the table. "I was paid to sign the statement," Mrs. Thorne said. She named the amount. It was not a small one. And she named the intermediary, a solicitor's clerk in Bath, who had presented himself as acting on behalf of an unnamed party in a household dispute. Vivienne looked at the envelope. "What is this?" "The original drainage inspection report," Mrs. Thorne said. "Mr. Ashcroft gave it to me to file 3 years ago, when I was still in the household. He told me to hold it for him until he asked for it back. He never asked. I kept it." She paused. "I kept it because I thought, at the time, that it might matter one day." Vivienne broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the document inside. She read the first page in silence, then the second. Then she set it down on the table beside Rowan's records and looked at the alignment of what she was seeing. The inspection report confirmed that the drainage works invoiced to the county board across 3 years had never been carried out. It confirmed that the contracted sums had been absorbed into private accounts. It bore Gideon Ashcroft's countersignature at the bottom of each page, authorizing the filing of the report with the county board. A filing that had never taken place, because the report had been handed to a household seamstress and told to wait. Vivienne looked at Mrs. Thorne. "Will you repeat what you have told me?" she said. "In front of the county assembly?" Mrs. Thorne looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Vivienne. "If I am not left to face it alone," she said. "You will not be alone," Vivienne said. "I give you my word." That night, after Mrs. Thorne had gone and Harriet had retired, Vivienne sat at the parlor table with Rowan and the documents between them. And she did something she had not planned to do. She reached into the leather satchel she had carried from Aldervale Manor, the one containing the annotated ledgers, and she drew out the 3rd year's account book, the one with the September discrepancy. She opened it to the back pages, where she had placed the folded letter 4 days ago, and she took the letter out and set it on the table between them. She did not speak. She did not explain. She placed the letter on the table and left her hand beside it and watched him. Rowan looked at the letter. He looked at the fold lines, the handwriting, the age of the paper. He did not touch it. He sat very still for a long moment. "Where did you find it?" he said. "In the lower shelf of the library," she said. "In the ledger behind the one we were working from." He was quiet. "I want to ask you something," Vivienne said. "And I need you to answer it honestly, because I am about to walk into a county assembly with you, and I cannot do that if I do not know where I stand." "Ask," he said. "Is any of it still true?" He looked at the letter on the table between them. He looked at her. He said without hesitation and without qualification, "It is all still true." She drew a breath. She looked at the drainage report and the ledgers and the small notebook in which she had written Caldwell's exact words on a wet bath pavement. And she thought about 4 years of folding napkins and locking doors and working through the small hours. And she thought about a letter that had been written and never sent by a man who believed he had nothing to offer. "I intend to stand in front of the assembly," she said, "with or without you." "I will be there," Rowan said. She picked up the letter and put it back in the ledger. She closed the ledger and set it on top of the pile. She pulled the drainage report toward herself and began to read it again from the beginning, making notes in the margin in her clear, unhurried hand. And Rowan opened his own records beside her. And they worked until the candle burned low and the city outside the window went quiet. The Bath County Assembly met in a hall on the upper floor of the Civic Building on a Wednesday in late February, in the particular atmosphere of a gathering that believes itself to be conducting routine business and has not yet understood that the morning is about to become something else. The session on estate administration was 3rd on the agenda. Vivienne had arrived before the doors opened and had taken a seat at the petitioner's bench with her satchel on the table before her and her notebook in her coat pocket, and Mrs. Thorne seated 2 rows behind her. Rowan was at the back of the hall. She had seen him come in. She had not looked at him since. The presiding magistrate, a man named Forsyth, who had the distracted authority of someone accustomed to managing proceedings that did not surprise him, called the session to order. The first 2 items were disposed of in 20 minutes. When the clerk read out the 3rd item, Vivienne rose. "Mr. Forsyth," she said, "I am Vivienne Marsh, formerly administrator of the domestic accounts of Aldervale Manor. I am petitioning this assembly under the provisions for public record inquiry on a matter relating to drainage expenditure claims submitted to this board on behalf of Aldervale Estate in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd years of the current decade." Gideon Ashcroft, who was seated with his solicitor on the opposite side of the hall, said, She has no standing to address this assembly. Forsyth looked at Vivienne. On what basis do you petition, Mrs. Marsh? On the basis that I administered the household records from which the estate's own maintenance logs were drawn during the period in question, Vivienne said, and that I have identified discrepancies between those logs and the invoices submitted to this board. She opened her satchel and placed the annotated summary on the petitioner's table. She placed the drainage inspection report beside it. She placed Rowan's independent correspondence records beside that. She arranged them with the same precision she brought to everything. Each document in order, each page turned to the relevant section, each figure already marked with a small penciled cross. The invoice submitted to this board in November of the first year, she said, claims drainage work completed on the north field and the lower pasture of Aldervale Estate, at a cost of £380. The estate's own maintenance log for November of that year records fencing repairs and rethatching. It contains no entry for drainage work. She turned to the next page. The invoice submitted in February of the second year claims drainage work on the east boundary, at a cost of £410. The maintenance log for February of that year contains no corresponding entry. She turned to the third page. The invoice submitted in September of the third year. These documents are forgeries, Gideon said. The hall shifted. Several members of the assembly turned toward Gideon, then back toward Vivienne. Forsyth raised his hand for quiet. Mr. Ashcroft, Forsyth said, you will have the opportunity to respond. The woman before you, Gideon said, and his voice had the controlled authority of a man accustomed to being believed, has been in a state of considerable distress for some months. She has no expertise in estate administration, no formal standing in county proceedings, and no reliable basis for the claims she is making. I would ask the assembly to consider the source before it entertains documents that have been assembled in a private house by a party with obvious personal motivation. Vivienne looked at him across the hall. She had heard him speak with that particular voice before. The voice of a man who has learned that confidence, delivered at sufficient volume, can substitute for evidence in a room full of people who are predisposed to believe him. She turned back to Forsyth. I also have the original drainage inspection report, she said, which was commissioned by Aldervale Estate in the third year and which was never submitted to this board. She placed the document on the table. The report confirms that the drainage works described in all three invoices were not carried out. It confirms that the contracted sums were absorbed into private accounts. It bears Mr. Ashcroft's countersignature on each page. The hall was very quiet. Then Rowan stood up. He was at the back of the room, and he stood the way he did everything. Without announcement, without preparation, simply as a man who has decided that something needs to be done and is doing it. He said his name and his former position clearly enough that the clerk could write it down. I am Lord Rowan Ashcroft, he said. I served as estate administrator of Aldervale Manor for 7 years, until my resignation was submitted to this registry 3 weeks ago. I wish to confirm, for the record of this assembly, the figures presented by Mrs. Marsh. Mr. Ashcroft, Forsyth said, leaning forward. The invoice figures she has cited are accurate, Rowan said. I maintained independent records of the estate's correspondence and payment confirmations during my tenure. The discrepancies between the invoices submitted to this board and the work recorded in the estate's own maintenance logs are real. They are not errors of recording. They represent a deliberate misrepresentation of estate expenditure to the county board, carried out across a period of 3 years, and they are documented in the report Mrs. Marsh has placed before you. Gideon said, You have no loyalty to this family. I have loyalty to the truth, Rowan said. The two have not always been the same thing. The hall was very still. Forsyth looked at the documents on the petitioner's table. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Rowan, still standing at the back of the room. He looked at Vivian, who was standing at the lectern with her hands resting on the edge of the table, and her face entirely composed. "I am calling for this session to be suspended," Forsyth said, "pending a formal inquiry into the drainage expenditure claims submitted to this board by Aldervale Estate." He looked at the clerk. "The documents presented by Mrs. Marsh are to be entered into the record." He reached for his pen. Gideon left the hall. He did not look at Vivian as he went. He did not look at Rowan. He walked out through the side door with his solicitor at his elbow, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was, in the circumstances, very final. Vivienne remained standing at the lectern. The hall emptied around her, assembly members gathering their papers, the clerk recording the session details. Two county officials in quiet conversation near the windows. She stood and watched until Forsyth had signed the inquiry order and dated it and set down his pen. He looked up and saw her still there, and he turned the document so that she could read it from where she stood. And she read it, and she nodded once. Then she picked up her satchel, and she walked out of the hall, and at the bottom of the stairs, Rowan was waiting for her in the cold February air, and neither of them said anything at all, and that was exactly right. 6 weeks later, on a morning in early April when the light had finally remembered what warmth felt like, Vivian sat in the solicitor's office in Bath and signed the final documents of the inquiry settlement. The county inquiry had found in her favor on every point. The drainage claims had been confirmed as fraudulent. The separation petition had been granted, but not on Gideon's terms, on hers. She retained a capital settlement calculated from the estate's declared income during the 4 years she had administered it. The settlement was not a fortune, but it was hers, and it was real, and it was the product of work she had done and records she had kept, and a case she had built in a library in January, with a man who had brought her ledger books without being asked. The seamstress's claim against her had been formally retracted and expunged from the county record. Mrs. Thorne had stood in front of the inquiry and named the amount she had been paid and the man who had paid her, and the inquiry had believed her, and that chapter was closed. Vivienne picked up the pen and signed her name in the space the solicitor indicated. She signed it clearly and without hesitation. Vivian Marsh. Not Ashcroft, not Mrs. Anything. Simply the name she had been given at birth by a country parson who had believed that intelligence was not a class distinction, and which she had set aside 4 years ago in exchange for a position and a household, and the reasonable expectation that usefulness would be rewarded with permanence. The solicitor offered her a copy of the documents. She put them in her satchel, thanked him by name, and went out into the April morning. She had a rented house outside Bath now, a small one with a garden that faced south and a writing table positioned under the window where the light was good. Harriet had helped her find it. The brass key that Harriet had pressed into her hand at Aldervale Manor in January now hung on a hook beside the kitchen door, and every time Vivian looked at it, she felt something she was still learning to name. Not relief exactly, and not triumph, but something that occupied the same territory as both. She had been in the garden for perhaps half an hour on a Tuesday morning in late May, cutting back the lavender that had grown too far over the path during the weeks she had been too occupied with other matters to attend to it, when she heard the garden gate open. She did not turn immediately. She finished the cut she was making, straightened up, and then turned. Rowan was standing inside the gate with his hat in his hand. He was wearing his good coat, which meant he had come from town. He looked exactly as he always looked, unhurried, precise, slightly uncertain in the way of a man who is better at action than at the approach to it. She pulled off her garden gloves and folded them over the handle of the cutting shears. "Why did you never send it?" she asked. She did not need to specify what she meant. They had not spoken of the letter since that night in Harriet's parlor, But it had been present in every conversation since. The way a third person is present in a room, even when they have stepped out. Rowan looked at the garden path for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I had nothing to offer," he said. "You had your honesty," she said. "You had 4 years of showing up with ledger books and waiting at gates and resigning positions you had spent your adult life building." She paused. "You had the truth, which is more than most people manage." He was quiet. He turned his hat once in his hands and then stopped turning it. "I did not think it was enough," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the only thing you got wrong." He crossed the garden. He did not rush, and she did not move back, because she had decided some time ago. She could not have said exactly when. Perhaps in the library in January, perhaps on the pavement outside Caldwell's office, perhaps at the back of a county assembly hall watching a man stand up and speak the truth at considerable personal cost. That she was finished with the habit of making herself smaller to accommodate other people's uncertainty. He kissed her. It was the first thing either of them had done that was not part of a plan, and it was better for that. It was unhurried, and it was honest. And it was the kind of thing that does not need to be narrated, because the woman standing in a spring garden with lavender on her gloves and a settled case in her satchel already knows exactly what it means. Several weeks later, on a quiet evening when the garden light was going gold, and the writing table was positioned just so under the window, Vivian sat down and wrote a letter. It was a short one. Half a page, no more. She wrote it without drafting it first, which was unusual for her. She said what she meant in the order she meant it, without ceremony and without apology. She signed it at the bottom, in the same hand she had used on the solicitor's documents in April, on the county assembly petitioner's forms in February, on the annotated ledger pages in January. She signed it Vivian Marsh, and for the first time in 4 years, for the first time, perhaps, in her adult life, the name felt entirely, unreservedly, and permanently her own. She folded the letter. She sealed it. She set it on the corner of the writing table to go out with the morning post. Then she looked out at the garden in the last of the evening light. And she was quiet. And the quiet was not the silence of a woman making no sound, because it is safer that way. It was the quiet of a woman who has said what she needed to say, and signed her name where it belongs, and has the rest of the evening entirely to herself.